Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're tearing into the anatomy of the opioid crisis. I mean, how exactly does a single family go from running a local psychiatric ward to becoming the primary architects of a literal national tragedy? Well, we're going to trace the data, the timelines, and some pretty shocking internal documents to figure out exactly how this all went down. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. $14 billion. That is the sheer size of the drug empire built by the Sackler family. But as we dig into the source material, you'll see that this massive fortune wasn't just built on your standard medical innovation. No, it was built on a calculated, highly orchestrated foundation of deception that would completely change the landscape of modern medicine.
To really grasp how this happened, we first have to look at the foundational ideology of the entire Sackler empire. Listen to this anchor quote from Arthur Sackler. "The drug is not the problem, reckless patients are the problem." We're just going to let those stark words speak for themselves here. But keep them in mind because this mindset, shifting the blame entirely onto the end user, this became the absolute core defense mechanism for the family's business practices for decades to come.
So let's look at the timeline to see how this builds. Back in the 1940s, the three Sackler brothers worked at Creedmoor Psychiatric Hospital. They were spending their days administering some pretty traumatizing electroshock therapies, but they soon grew convinced that there had to be a better way, that mental and physical ailments were really just chemical problems that needed chemical solutions. Basically, they believed a pill could fix anything. By 1952, they bought up a small pharmaceutical company called Purdue, and fast forward to the 1960s, the eldest brother, Arthur, is completely revolutionizing the world of medical advertising.
And when I say revolutionizing, I mean Arthur aggressively crossed some major ethical lines. His playbook was simple, but ruthless. Step 1, hire doctors as salesmen to pitch products to other doctors. Step 2, literally pay off a division head at the FDA to promote his drugs. And step 3, actually invent fake doctors to quote in their medical ads. He used these shady tactics to mass-market tranquilizers like Valium and Librium. Now, Arthur died before the modern opioid crisis really kicked off, but he laid down a dangerous blueprint that the next generation of Sacklers would escalate to an almost unimaginable level.
Which brings us directly to Section 1, the OxyContin Blueprint, designing a blockbuster.
Now, what's really interesting here is the sheer pharmacological leap the company took. See, their patent for a successful cancer pain drug called MS-Contin was expiring. They were staring down a massive patent cliff and absolutely needed a new blockbuster product to avoid a catastrophic drop in profits. So what do? They look at morphine, which is a standard opioid, and they compare it to oxycodone, a drug that is twice as strong. Purdue's highly lucrative idea was to take this incredibly potent opioid and just coat it in their 12-hour continuum time-release system. And boom, they called it OxyContin.
But to get this new superdrug approved for widespread, everyday use, Purdue secured an incredibly unprecedented relationship with FDA medical reviewer Curtis Wright. I mean, get this. Purdue executives literally camped out in a rented hotel room for 3 days just to help draft the FDA's review of their own drug application. Wright approved it. And then, surprisingly enough, shortly after that, Curtis Wright leaves the FDA and gets hired by Purdue Pharma for a starting salary of over $370,000 a year.
That exceptionally cozy relationship resulted in the specific, incredibly vague label you see right here. It reads, "Delayed absorption is believed to reduce the abuse liability of the drug." Look really closely at that phrasing. It doesn't say proven to, it says believed to. And based on what evidence? Literally none. But this single, unscientific sentence, approved by Wright, became Purdue's absolute greatest marketing weapon. Sales reps used it to assure cautious doctors all over the country that OxyContin was, for all intents and purposes, non-addictive.
It gets even more audacious when you break down the famous less than 1% addiction myth. Purdue actually coached their vast army of sales reps to lie to doctors, telling them addiction was practically a statistical impossibility. And what was their ironclad scientific proof for this? A 5-sentence letter to the editor in a 1980 magazine. That's it. It wasn't a peer-reviewed study, it wasn't even about OxyContin, and it relied on a tiny sample size in a highly controlled hospital setting. Armed with this total misinformation, Purdue spent millions showering doctors with gifts, lavish lunches, and all-expenses-paid medical conferences. The 2-by multiplier you see here really tells the whole story. Purdue's own internal data proved that physicians who attended these company-funded dinners wrote more than double the number of prescriptions. It was incredibly effective.
And this brilliantly illustrates the extreme lengths Purdue went to just to maintain those sky-high prescription rates. See, they ran into a massive clinical hurdle. Their claim that OxyContin provided 12 hours of relief, it was factually false for a lot of patients, who started experiencing severe withdrawal much earlier. But instead of admitting the drug wore off quickly, Purdue embraced this entirely fabricated medical concept called pseudo-addiction. They instructed their sales reps to tell doctors that withdrawal symptoms didn't actually mean the patient was addicted. No, it simply meant the patient was on too low of a dose. The prescribed solution? Just give them more drugs.
This aggressive, totally unchecked marketing leads us directly into the year 2000 and Section 2, the epidemic unleashed.
By the year 2000, OxyContin had officially crossed the $1 billion mark in annual sales. But behind closed doors, a massive cover-up was underway. As these facts clearly document from their own internal emails, top executives were completely aware of the abuse. They knew people were crushing the pills to bypass the time release and get a heroin-like high. And their response? They directed staff to delete all mentions of the word addiction from their communications and actively ignored stark warnings from their own employees about rising overdoses and soaring crime rates.
In fact, instead of halting production, the company's president, Richard Sackler, sent an email doubling down on his uncle Arthur's old philosophy. He wrote, "We have to hammer on the abusers in every way possible. They're the culprit and the problem. They're reckless criminals, scum of the earth." Notice how perfectly this connects back to that very first quote we looked at? This strategy of blaming the victims, even legitimate pain patients who strictly follow their doctor's orders, remain the family's primary defense mechanism to protect their profits.
But eventually, the overwhelming data and the absolute public health fallout started to catch up with them. Which brings us to Section 3, the illusion of justice. In 2007, thanks to a small group of really persistent, unbribable government officials who spent years building a meticulous case, Purdue Pharma was finally taken to trial. They ultimately pleaded guilty to fraudulently marketing OxyContin and deliberately hiding its abuse potential. The fine handed down to them? $600 million. So the crucial point here is comparing that fine to the revenue figure you see right here. $3 billion. That $3 billion is the revenue Purdue made from OxyContin in that exact same year. So internally, a $600 million fine wasn't a deterrent at all. It wasn't some business-ending penalty. It was essentially categorized as a speeding ticket on the autobahn of their profits. Just look impartially at the 2007 aftermath. The guilty executives served 0 jail time. In fact, they actually received financial bonuses. Did Purdue scale back their aggressive tactics? Absolutely not. The Sacklers voted to expand their sales force by another 100 reps immediately following the conviction, and they happily paid themselves hundreds of millions of dollars in dividends. Fundamentally, nothing changed about their business model. Meanwhile, out in the real world, a terrifying unintended consequence was taking root. Following that 2007 trial, some doctors finally began slowing down their opioid prescriptions. But for the millions of patients who were already chemically dependent, having their supply abruptly cut off meant enduring horrendous withdrawal. As this chart clearly visualizes, 80% of heroin users in the 2010s started with prescription opioids like OxyContin. By tightening the tap, doctors inadvertently forced an entire population straight to the black market, turning OxyContin into a direct gateway for cheaper street drugs like heroin and fentanyl.
As the epidemic just raged on, state after state finally began mounting massive, coordinated lawsuits leading right up to the year 2020. By this point, OxyContin had generated a staggering $35 billion in lifetime sales, and it seemed like an $8 billion legal settlement was finally on the horizon to help address this massive national fallout.
But in a final, pretty shocking twist, Purdue declared bankruptcy, claiming they simply didn't have the funds to pay the $8 billion settlement. Now, how is that mathematically possible? Well, notice this $10 billion figure. Anticipating the inevitable lawsuits, the Sackler family had engaged in a highly calculated financial maneuver over the course of several years. They systematically extracted more than $10 billion out of Purdue and funneled it straight into their own personal offshore bank accounts. They effectively hollowed out the company entirely so that the corporation appeared totally broke on paper. And while they were negotiating a highly unusual deal to pay around $6 billion in exchange for full, permanent personal immunity from future civil lawsuits, one family member actually stated, "I have yet to see anything illegal or even immoral that this company has done." They even complained about the bad press ruining their family's reputation. Reading this impartially from the source, it just highlights an absolute staggering disconnect between the boardroom executives and the grim reality out on the ground. And that reality is captured in this single, somber, documented fact. In America, opioids now take more lives than cars or guns. Let that sit with you for a second. This isn't just an abstract business case study, it's a documentation of a lasting, systemic tragedy that originated purely from corporate strategy and profit motives.
Which brings us to a final, provocative thought to leave you with today. When a corporation engineers a national crisis of this magnitude, can financial settlements ever equal true justice? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, keep looking at the data, and we will see you next time.